30 days left on the easement. Nobody in that subdivision knew it existed. 50 homes. 1 dirt road. 1 signature. The HOA president laughed when I mentioned it. That road has always been ours, she said. I just smiled and said nothing. She had no idea what I was holding. By the end of the month, that gate would never open for her again. My name is Sarah Whitfield, and I run cattle on 1,100 acres my grandfather bought in 1958. Land that has been in my family for 3 generations. Quiet, unglamorous, and mine. 15 years ago, a developer leased a strip of our northern pasture to build a private access road for a new subdivision, Meadow Creek Estates, on the understanding that the lease would expire and the homes would need another way out. I didn't think much about Meadow Creek Estates for years. Their fences went up, their sprinklers ran, their kids waved from golf carts. I kept my cattle, my fences, and my distance, content to let 2 separate worlds exist side by side. Then Denise Callahan became HOA president, and the letters started arriving. Complaints about the smell of manure carrying downwind of decency, as she put it, and demands that I move my herd, install odor barriers, or trim my tree line to protect her members' views. I answered the first letter politely, explaining that my ranch predated her subdivision by 4 decades, and that agriculture was a protected use under county zoning. She replied with a longer letter, citing HOA bylaws that governed, in her words, adjacent nuisance properties, bylaws that did not apply to me at all. At the spring community meeting, Denise stood at the podium and told 50 homeowners that the rancher next door refused to be a good neighbor. I hadn't been invited, hadn't been consulted, and hadn't even been named. Yet somehow I was already the villain of a story I didn't know was being told. My neighbor Ruth, who'd lived in Meadow Creek since it broke ground, called to warn me. She's not going to stop, Ruth said. She ran the last board member out over a mailbox color. You're the biggest thing she's ever had to fight. I laughed it off at first. Her complaints felt small compared to running a working ranch. Calving season, drought, and the mortgage on equipment that never stopped breaking. Denise Callahan was an annoyance, not a threat, or so I believed at the time. Then came the drone, calving pens at 6 in the morning. Camera lens pointed straight at my barn. When I called the number on its tag, a clipped voice informed me the HOA was documenting code violations on adjacent land for a future complaint file. I drove straight to the subdivision office, a converted clubhouse with a fountain out front, and asked Denise directly why she was filming my property. She smiled, folded her hands, and said homeowners had a right to visual assurance that neighboring land met community standards, standards she alone seemed to define. I told her, calmly, that my land wasn't subject to her standards. She tilted her head, the way people do right before they say something designed to wound, and replied that perhaps I should consider selling, since ranching doesn't really fit the vision anymore for the area she now considered hers. That was the first time I understood this wasn't about manure or drones or mailbox colors. Denise Callahan wanted my land, or at least wanted it gone from her view, folded quietly into memory, replaced by something with a homeowners association fee and a matching roof color like everyone else's. I went home that night and pulled the old filing cabinet from my grandfather's office, the one full of yellowed deeds, surveys, and correspondence he'd kept meticulously for 60 years. Somewhere in there, I remembered, was the paperwork for the access road the developer had begged him to allow. I found the folder past midnight, dust thick on the tab. Inside was a single-page agreement, signed in 1994, granting a temporary construction and access easement across our northern pasture for 15 years, renewable only by mutual written consent, expiring automatically if no renewal was filed before the deadline. 15 years. In 1995. I did the math twice to be sure, my pulse picking up in the quiet kitchen. The renewal deadline had passed 9 years ago. Nobody had ever filed for renewal. Legally, technically, the road 50 families used every day belonged entirely to me. I sat with that fact for a long time, turning it over like a stone in my palm. I hadn't gone looking for power over anyone. I'd only gone looking for an old document to defend my fence line. Instead, I'd found the key to Meadow Creek Estate's only way out. For a week, I told no one, not even Ruth. I drove past the subdivision gate every morning, watching school buses and delivery trucks roll through the entrance that sat, unknowingly, on borrowed time. Denise's complaints kept coming. I kept filing them away, unanswered, waiting to understand what I actually had. I called a land use attorney in the county seat, a woman named Priya Anand who'd handled easement disputes for 20 years. She read the document twice, then looked up at me over her glasses. "This lapsed," she said. "You could shut that road down tomorrow if you wanted." "I don't want to hurt 50 families, I told her. And I meant it. Whatever Denise was, the people living behind her gate were just people. Commuting, raising kids, mowing lawns. Priya nodded. Average. Not a weapon. But no, it's there. I decided, for the moment, to hold my peace and simply stop responding to Denise's letters altogether. Silence, I figured, might cool things down. I was wrong. Person who thrives on control quite like being ignored. And Denise Callahan noticed my silence almost immediately. Within 2 weeks, the letters shifted from complaints to threats, vague references to escalating this to the county, and involving legal counsel if I didn't comply with demands I'd never agreed to follow. I filed each one in a growing folder beside my grandfather's easement. Patient. Watching. Waiting. I didn't yet know that Denise had her own secret folder. One she guarded far more carefully than mine. Filled with numbers that didn't add up. Meetings that never happened. And a truth about Meadow Creek's finances that would eventually matter far more than any mailbox color ever had. What I did know, standing at my kitchen window one evening watching the subdivision lights flicker on in neat, identical rows, was that a storm was coming. And unlike Denise, I had already found the one door she couldn't afford to have closed. The first real clash came at a joint meeting the county forced after Denise filed a formal nuisance complaint against my ranch, dragging me into a folding chair in that same clubhouse, facing 50 homeowners who'd been told, repeatedly, that I was the reason their property values were falling. Denise opened with a slideshow, photos of my cattle, my manure piles, my unsightly barn, narrated in the tone of a woman presenting evidence at a trial. She never once mentioned that my ranch had existed decades before her subdivision's foundation was poured into what used to be my grandfather's hayfield. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, kept my voice level, and simply asked the room a question. Does anyone here know how your neighborhood gets its water main access and road frontage? Silence. Blank faces. Just slightly, like she sensed a shift in the air. I didn't reveal the easement that night. I wasn't ready, and I didn't trust the room yet to hear it fairly. Instead, I simply stated facts. My ranch predated their homes, Agriculture was zoned and protected, and no drone, no bylaw, no complaint could override 40 years of prior legal use. Denise interrupted twice, was gavelled down once by the county mediator, and finally sat with her arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes narrowed at me like I'd embarrassed her in front of her own kingdom. For the first time, I saw something behind her composure, not confidence. After the meeting, Ruth caught up with me in the parking lot. "You didn't even use your best card," she said quietly, having overheard enough from neighbors to guess something. I told her I wasn't ready. She squeezed my arm. "Half this neighborhood will thank you for it." Denise wasn't done. She filed a formal complaint with the county planning office, claiming my unregulated agricultural operation violated setback requirements near the shared road. Requirements that, again, did not apply to land established before her subdivision's zoning ever existed on paper. The county sent an inspector, a tired man named Hal who walked my fence line, checked my permits, and told me flatly, "Ma'am, you're fine. Somebody's just trying to make your life difficult." I told him I was starting to understand exactly how difficult that somebody intended to make it. Denise, undeterred by the inspector's findings, began a new tactic, rallying homeowners door to door, telling them I was hoarding water rights that belonged to the community. A claim so untrue it would have been funny if it weren't clearly designed to turn 50 families against a woman most had never even met. Ruth called me one evening, laughing despite herself. "She told the Pattersons you diverted the creek," Ruth said. "There is no creek near your ranch, Sarah." I laughed too, but underneath it, something cold settled in my chest. Denise wasn't just controlling. She was willing to invent whatever story she needed. I decided it was time to learn more about Denise Callahan herself. Quietly, carefully, the way you'd study a storm system before deciding whether to board up the windows or just ride it out. What I found in public county and court records surprised even me. Denise had been HOA president of 2 other communities before Meadow Creek Estates, both 2 counties over. Both places she'd left abruptly after disputes involving, according to old local news archives, unauthorized special assessments charged to homeowners for repairs that records suggested were never actually completed. Neither community had pressed charges. Both boards had simply voted her out and quietly closed the matter, the way people do when they want the drama gone more than they want justice. Denise had learned, seemed, that consequences rarely followed her if she simply moved on to somewhere new. Meadow Creek Estates, I realized, wasn't just her home. It was her third act, her third chance to build the tightly controlled little kingdom that seemed to satisfy something in her nobody else fully understood. A kingdom she now saw my ranch as the last unconquered territory bordering her walls. Armed with that history, I felt less angry and, strangely, more focused. This wasn't personal cruelty aimed at me specifically. It was a pattern, one that had simply arrived at my fence line this time. Patterns, I knew from ranching, could be predicted, and predicted patterns could be prepared for. I brought what I'd found to Priya, who nodded slowly as she read through the printouts. "This helps," she said. "Not legally, not yet, but it tells us what kind of fight this is. She won't stop at complaints. Watch for her to escalate financially, or through the board itself." Priya was right sooner than either of us expected. 2 weeks later, Denise pushed through a new special assessment at an emergency board meeting. $400 per household, officially for landscaping and entry beautification, though several homeowners quietly told Ruth they'd seen no new landscaping anywhere near the entrance. Ruth herself refused to pay, questioning the assessment publicly at the next meeting, asking for itemized invoices Denise couldn't seem to produce. Denise responded by threatening a lien on Ruth's home. The same tactic, Ruth later learned, Denise had used against dissenters in both of her previous communities. That threat, more than anything aimed at me, changed something in the neighborhood's mood. People who'd shrugged off my manure and mailbox complaints as harmless HOA nonsense began quietly wondering what else Denise might be doing with money nobody was allowed to fully see or question. I still hadn't shown my hand. I was watching Denise build her own downfall one overreach at a time, brick by brick, the same way she'd probably watched other people's small mistakes for years, waiting for the moment weakness would finally show through the cracks in someone else's composure. Then, on a Tuesday morning I'll never forget, Denise crossed a line I hadn't anticipated, one that would push this quiet standoff over fence lines and easements into something far more dangerous and far more personal for both of us. My ranch hand Miguel called me from the north pasture, his voice tight with alarm. A survey crew, hired, turned out, by the HOA itself, was staking flags across my land near the access road, measuring what Denise later described publicly as the community's rightful road frontage into my property. I drove out immediately and found 3 men in orange vests. Tape measures stretched across ground my grandfather had grazed cattle on for 60 years. When I asked who authorized this, the crew leader shrugged and said simply, HOA president said it was fine. Said this was community land. It was not community land. It had never been community land. I ordered them off my property, called the sheriff's non-emergency line to document the trespass, and drove straight to Denise's house, my hands still trembling with an anger I hadn't let myself feel fully until that exact moment. Denise answered the door as if she'd been expecting a compliment. We're just clarifying boundaries for the county, she said breezily, before I'd even spoken, as though clarifying meant sending strangers to stake flags across a stranger's private grazing land without so much as a phone call first. I told her plainly that she'd just trespassed, and that the survey she'd ordered would mean nothing, because she didn't own an inch of the ground her crew had measured. Denise's smile thinned. We'll see what the county says, she replied, about who really controls that road. That word, controls, stuck with me the whole drive home. Not owns. It was, I realized later, the most honest thing Denise had said to me yet, the one true confession buried inside all her posturing. This had never been about property lines. It was about who held power. I called Priya that night, shaken in a way manure complaints and drone footage had never managed to shake me. She sent a survey crew onto my land, I told her. Priya was quiet for a moment, then said, Sarah, I think it's time. Show her exactly what she's dealing with. Priya drafted a formal letter on my behalf, citing the lapsed 1994 easement in full legal detail, notifying the Meadow Creek Estates HOA that the access road crossing my northern pasture had reverted entirely to private ownership 9 years earlier, with no valid renewal on county record anywhere. We didn't send it demanding closure. Not yet. We sent it simply stating fact, inviting Denise and the board to begin good faith negotiations for a new easement agreement, one with terms I would control for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun months earlier. The response came fast, and it wasn't from Denise. It was from the HOA's attorney, a curt man who called the claim meritless and insisted the road had been dedicated to the county decades ago, a claim that, if true, would have made my grandfather's easement completely irrelevant. Priya requested the dedication paperwork immediately. Days passed. The attorney stopped returning calls. County records, when Priya finally searched them herself, showed absolutely no dedication filing for that road, ever, at any point in the subdivision's entire 29-year history of existence. They're bluffing, Priya told me, satisfaction plain in her voice. Or worse for them, they genuinely believed it was dedicated and never checked. Either way, Sarah, that road belongs to you, on paper, in fact, and in law. Nobody has proven otherwise, because they can't. Word of the dispute had, by now, spread through Meadow Creek estates like water through cracked concrete. Homeowners who'd once nodded along with Denise's complaints about my ranch started asking a very different, far more uncomfortable question among themselves. What exactly happens to us if that road actually closes? Denise called an emergency meeting to address what she called rumors and misinformation being spread about the community's access rights. She stood at the podium, more rattled than I'd ever seen her, insisting repeatedly that the neighborhood's access was completely secure and that I was simply harassing good people. I attended that meeting for the first time since the nuisance complaint, sitting quietly in the back row. When homeowners began directing panicked questions at Denise about dedication paperwork, she deflected, changed subjects, and finally claimed the HOA's attorney was handling everything behind closed doors nobody else could see into. Ruth stood and asked the question that finally cracked the room's patience. Denise, can you show us the dedication filing? Just show us the paper. Review, a phrase that, to a room full of increasingly worried homeowners, sounded exactly like what it was, nothing at all. After the meeting, 3 separate homeowners approached me in the parking lot, quietly, almost apologetically, asking if what they'd heard was true. I told them honestly that I didn't want anyone's home threatened, that I only wanted my land respected, and that the choice about what happened next wasn't only mine. That night, Denise sent me a single text message, the first direct communication she'd ever sent instead of a formal letter. It read simply, "You have no idea what you're starting." I stared at it a long time before deciding, finally, that I did have an idea, and I wasn't afraid. The following week, an anonymous letter arrived at my ranch. No return address, warning me vaguely about consequences if I continued threatening the community. I photographed it immediately and gave a copy to the sheriff's department, along with a copy to Priya, who added it quietly to our growing file. Around the same time, Miguel found a section of my northern fence cut clean through overnight, cattle scattered across 2 pastures by morning. There was no proof it was Denise, nothing that would hold up anywhere, but the timing, arriving just days after her text message, felt impossible to ignore entirely. I filed a police report anyway, documenting everything, building a timeline I hoped I'd never actually need to use against anyone. Priya reviewed it and nodded grimly. "Keep documenting," she said. "People like this rarely stop escalating on their own. They escalate until something finally stops them." Ruth, meanwhile, had quietly begun gathering her own information inside the neighborhood. Homeowners who'd questioned assessments, homeowners who'd been threatened with liens, homeowners who simply wanted to know where years of HOA dues had actually gone. What she found would soon matter far more than any fence or road. A retired accountant named Frank Delgado, who lived 2 doors from Denise, told Ruth quietly that he'd requested the HOA's full financial records 18 months earlier under his rights as a member, and had been stonewalled every single time. with excuses ranging from, "the accountant is unavailable," to outright silence. Frank had kept his own rough estimates instead, tracking dues paid against visible community expenses, landscaping, pool maintenance, the entrance beautification project that had somehow never actually beautified anything. His numbers showed a gap, a real one, tens of thousands of dollars nobody could account for anywhere. Ruth brought Frank's notes to me almost apologetically, as if worried I'd think it was unrelated to my own fight. I told her it was the opposite of unrelated. Denise's need for control over my land and her need for control over the HOA's books were, I suspected, the exact same instinct. I shared Frank's findings with Priya, who immediately recognized the shape of what we might be looking at. "If there's embezzlement," she said carefully, "that changes everything. That's not just a civil easement dispute anymore. That's criminal exposure for her, and leverage neither of us has needed to use yet." We agreed, for now, to keep building quietly rather than accuse anything publicly without proof. Denise, unaware of Frank's notes, unaware of Ruth's growing network inside the neighborhood, continued treating the entire dispute as though sheer force of personality alone could make an expired legal document simply disappear. She doubled down instead, mailing every homeowner a glossy newsletter insisting the so-called easement issue was resolved, and that anyone spreading false rumors about road access would face HOA disciplinary action. A threat with no actual legal teeth, though it frightened several older residents badly enough to stop asking questions. That newsletter, ironically, became the turning point for many undecided homeowners. People who'd trusted Denise for years began noticing how aggressively she silenced questions rather than simply answering them, how thin her explanations grew the moment anyone asked to see paperwork instead of just her reassurances. I stayed quiet publicly through all of it, letting Denise's own behavior do work I never could have done through argument alone. Every threat she made, every stone-walled question, every unexplained dollar, chipped away at the wall of trust she'd spent years building around herself inside that subdivision. By the time Priya finally finished her full legal review, confirming beyond doubt that the easement had lapsed and no valid dedication existed anywhere in county records, I understood we were no longer simply negotiating from strength. We were standing at the edge of something Denise could no longer control at all. For a short while, an uneasy quiet settled over the whole dispute. Denise stopped sending letters. The anonymous threats stopped. Even the drone never returned to hover over my calving pens again, and I allowed myself, cautiously, to hope the worst of it might finally be behind us. I used the lull to focus on my ranch again. Calving season in full swing. Exhausted nights checking on new mothers and their calves under starlight. The kind of work that had always grounded me whenever the world outside my fence line grew too loud or too strange to make sense of. Ruth mentioned that Denise had been seen leaving the county records office twice that week, though nobody knew exactly why. Frank speculated she was searching for some overlooked dedication paperwork, some forgotten filing that might rescue her claim. Priya suspected she was simply confirming, privately, how badly she'd already lost. I let myself believe, briefly, that Denise might quietly negotiate a new easement now that the truth was undeniable, that pragmatism might finally outweigh pride. Priya was less optimistic. "People like her don't fold," she warned me. "They just change tactics. Watch for something bigger than what we've seen so far." I should have listened more closely. The quiet, turned out, wasn't peace. It was Denise regrouping, gathering whatever resources her position still gave her, preparing not to negotiate but to fight harder than she ever had before, using tools far more damaging than survey crews or glossy newsletters. The calm ended on a Thursday afternoon when Priya called me, her voice unusually tight. Denise had filed an emergency injunction in county court, requesting a temporary restraining order preventing me from interfering with the community's established access road, while ownership was formally litigated in front of a judge. It was, Priya explained, a legal long shot given the paperwork we held, but a genuinely dangerous one nonetheless, since injunctions could sometimes freeze situations in place for months regardless of who ultimately held the stronger underlying claim to the disputed land itself. I asked Priya bluntly what Denise's actual chances were. Slim, she said. But slim isn't zero, and this buys her time. Time to keep pretending the road is secure. Time to keep the assessment money flowing. Time to keep her grip on Meadow Creek intact a little longer. We prepared our response immediately, gathering the 1994 easement, the county's confirmation of no dedication filing, Hal the inspector's report clearing my ranch of any zoning violations, and a sworn timeline of Denise's escalating harassment, from drones to survey crews to the cut fence Miguel had discovered. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, a window during which Denise, emboldened by the mere existence of the injunction filing, told homeowners at another emergency meeting that the court agrees this is complicated, a wild exaggeration of a filing that hadn't even been reviewed by a judge yet. Frank, quietly furious at the manipulation, finally decided he'd waited long enough for the financial answers he'd been denied. He filed a formal written demand, citing state HOA disclosure statutes, requiring Denise to produce complete financial records within 30 days or face potential legal consequences of her own. Denise's response to Frank was immediate and defensive, accusing him publicly of conspiring with me against the community, a claim that struck most homeowners, even ones who'd previously trusted her completely, as increasingly desperate rather than convincing, given everything else already unraveling around her leadership. By the end of that uneasy lull, 2 separate legal fronts had opened, mine over the easement, Frank's over the missing money, both converging toward Denise Callahan at almost exactly the same moment, though none of us yet knew just how directly connected those 2 fights truly were. Priya's office received an unexpected call from Hal, the county inspector, 2 weeks before the injunction hearing. He'd been reviewing old subdivision approval files for an unrelated matter and stumbled across something odd. The original 1995 construction permits for Meadow Creek Estates referenced my grandfather's easement by name, explicitly, in writing. That single detail mattered enormously. It meant the developer, and by extension the county, had always known the road access was temporary, tied directly to an expiring agreement, not a permanent dedication as Denise and her attorney kept insisting to increasingly skeptical homeowners at every meeting. Priya requested certified copies of those original permits immediately, worried they might mysteriously disappear from county files the moment anyone realized how damaging they truly were to Denise's entire legal position in the case she'd filed against me. The permits arrived within days. Stamped, dated, undeniable. Buried in an engineering note was a single sentence. Access secured via temporary 15-year easement. Whitfield Ranch parcel. Renewal required prior to expiration. It was, Priya said, the single strongest piece of evidence either side had produced in the entire dispute. I sat with that document a long time, feeling something shift inside me. Not triumph exactly, but a quiet, steady certainty that had been missing since the very first manure complaint letter arrived on my porch all those months earlier. The ground beneath Denise's entire case had just disappeared completely. Ruth, when I told her, laughed out loud for the first time in weeks. She built her whole kingdom on a 15-year loan, she said, shaking her head. And she never even bothered to check the due date. It was almost funny if it hadn't caused so much damage already. Denise, unaware of the permit discovery, continued preparing for the injunction hearing as though her position remained unshakable, holding another neighborhood meeting, where she promised homeowners the legal team was very confident in the community's chances. Confidence Priya suspected was built on nothing more than pure denial. Frank's 30-day deadline for financial disclosure arrived without a single document produced. Instead, Denise sent a letter claiming the HOA's records were being reorganized by a new bookkeeping service, an explanation that satisfied almost nobody, especially given how quickly it had appeared after Frank's formal demand. Several homeowners, emboldened by Frank and Ruth's growing questions, formed an informal group calling themselves simply the Concerned Owners, meeting in Ruth's living room to compare notes, share suspicions, and quietly begin discussing whether Denise should even remain HOA president through the end of her current term. Denise learned about the group within days, likely through a loyalist still reporting back to her, and responded by sending Ruth a formal cease and desist letter, claiming her informal gatherings violated HOA bylaws against unauthorized organizing, a bylaw, Priya confirmed, that simply did not exist anywhere in the community's actual documents. That letter, more than anything before it, convinced even longtime Denise supporters that something was seriously wrong with how their community was being run. You didn't threaten a retired schoolteacher over a book club-sized living room meeting unless you were desperately afraid of exactly what might get discussed there. I received a call from a Meadow Creek homeowner I'd never met, a young father named Devin, asking if he could see the easement documents himself. I agreed immediately, meeting him at a coffee shop outside the subdivision, laying out copies of everything Priya and I had gathered so far. Devin left that meeting quiet, unsettled, telling me he'd trusted Denise completely since moving in 3 years earlier, believing every complaint she'd raised about problem neighbors, without ever once questioning whether those complaints were fair, accurate, or even remotely true to begin with. Word of documented proof. Real permits. Real dates. Real evidence. Spread through Meadow Creek faster than any rumor Denise had ever spread about me. For the first time, the balance of trust inside that subdivision had visibly, undeniably, begun tilting away from her and toward simple, verifiable fact. Denise sensed it too. Her tone shifted from confident authority to something sharper, more defensive, snapping at homeowners who asked routine questions, cutting off Frank entirely when he tried to raise the financial disclosure issue again in front of the full assembled community. "I built this neighborhood," she said at one point, her voice cracking slightly with an emotion that looked, for just a moment, less like anger and more like fear. "I'm not going to let outsiders and troublemakers tear it apart over paperwork." The room went uncomfortably silent after she said it. That statement stuck with several homeowners long after the meeting ended. Devin told me later it was the first time he'd truly understood Denise saw Meadow Creek Estates not as a community she served, but as something she personally owned, something she'd fight to control regardless of what anyone else actually wanted. Priya, reviewing the injunction hearing preparations, felt increasingly confident given the newly discovered permits. "This isn't close anymore," she told me. "The only real question left is how badly Denise damages her own case and her own reputation before the judge even gets a chance to weigh in." Denise, meanwhile, made a decision that would prove to be her most serious miscalculation yet. Desperate for anything resembling leverage before the hearing, She reached out directly to my ranch hand Miguel, offering him money to confirm, in a sworn statement, that I'd verbally agreed to a permanent easement years earlier. Miguel, horrified, called me immediately after the conversation, still shaking with anger at being asked to lie under oath for a stranger's benefit. He'd recorded part of the call on his phone without even fully planning to, simply out of instinct once he'd realized what she was actually asking him to do. I brought the recording straight to Priya, who listened twice, her expression hardening with each replay. "This is witness tampering," she said quietly. "Attempted subornation of perjury, if we want to be precise about it. This isn't just going to help our case anymore, Sarah. This could end her HOA presidency entirely. We debated how to use it. Priya wanted to introduce it carefully, strategically, at the injunction hearing itself, where its impact on a judge would matter most. I wanted, selfishly perhaps, to simply confront Denise directly first, to see her face when she realized exactly what she'd walked into. We compromised. To Denise's attorney disclosing the recording's existence as evidence in the upcoming hearing, without revealing its full content yet, watching carefully to see how quickly, and how desperately, Denise's legal strategy might shift once she understood what we actually now possessed. The attorney's response arrived within hours, noticeably less confident than before, requesting a settlement conference to explore resolution options ahead of the scheduled hearing date. Priya smiled, reading it aloud to me over the phone. "There it is," she said.
"That's the sound of a..."
Denise, however, wasn't ready to fold quite yet. Not entirely. At the settlement conference, held in a small county mediation room, she sat rigid, arms crossed, insisting through her attorney that Miguel's recording was taken out of context, and that she'd merely been gathering information for the case. Priya calmly played the full recording anyway, Denise's voice unmistakable, offering Miguel $2,000 for a signed statement claiming a verbal agreement that had never existed. The mediator's expression shifted visibly. Even Denise's own attorney glanced away, clearly recognizing exactly how badly this reflected on his client's entire position. The settlement conference ended without agreement, but with something almost more valuable, an official record, witnessed by a neutral mediator, of Denise attempting to manufacture false evidence against me. Priya called it a gift we didn't even have to ask for, and I couldn't help but agree with her entirely. Word of the settlement conference leaked into Meadow Creek Estates within days, as these things always eventually do. The concerned owners group, now meeting openly rather than in secret, began openly discussing whether formal removal proceedings against Denise as HOA president were not just possible, but overdue. Frank, armed with both his financial suspicions and the growing evidence of Denise's misconduct, filed a formal petition demanding a special meeting to vote on her removal from the board, gathering signatures from homeowners far more easily than he'd ever expected given how quickly her support was crumbling. Denise responded to the petition the only way she seemed to know how, aggressively, dismissively, calling it a coordinated smear campaign led by outside troublemakers, a phrase that conveniently ignored the fact that Frank, Ruth, and Devin were, and had always been, her own actual neighbors inside the community. I stayed carefully outside the internal HOA politics, aware that my own fight over the easement was separate, legally, from whatever consequences Denise now faced from her own neighbors. But privately, I couldn't deny feeling something like vindication watching the community she'd controlled finally begin controlling itself instead. Devin told me the special removal meeting had been scheduled for 3 weeks out, timed almost poetically, just days before my own injunction hearing was set to occur. Meadow Creek Estates was hurtling toward two separate reckonings for Denise Callahan at nearly the exact same moment. Denise, sensing her authority slipping in real time, made one final aggressive move before the removal vote, quietly hiring a private investigator to dig into my personal life, my finances, my divorce years earlier, anything that might discredit me publicly before homeowners could vote against her instead. I learned about the investigator only because he made the mistake of approaching Ruth directly, asking probing questions about my character under the flimsy pretense of writing a community newsletter feature. Ruth, immediately suspicious, called me the moment he left her porch, still holding his business card. Priya traced the investigator's firm back to an invoice Denise had, carelessly, allowed to be paid directly from HOA operating funds, the very same account Frank had been demanding full disclosure on for months already. It was, Priya said, possibly the single sloppiest mistake Denise had made yet. That invoice, once uncovered through Frank's continued financial pressure, revealed something even bigger than the investigator's fee alone. Over 18 months, tens of thousands of dollars in HOA funds had been redirected toward expenses with no clear community benefit whatsoever. Expenses only Denise herself seemed to fully understand or control. Frank brought the invoice straight to the county, filing a formal complaint alleging misappropriation of association funds, a serious step that transformed what had started as an internal HOA financial dispute into something with genuine potential criminal exposure for Denise Callahan personally, not just professionally. Denise, cornered on multiple fronts now, the injunction hearing, the removal petition, and now a formal financial complaint, began behaving in ways even her closest remaining allies found increasingly hard to defend, snapping at homeowners, threatening lawsuits against Frank and Ruth personally, growing visibly frayed under mounting pressure. I received an unexpected late-night call from Denise herself, her voice tight, controlled fury barely masking something that sounded almost like desperation. "You did this," she said. "You turned my own neighborhood against me." I told her, calmly, that she'd done that entirely on her own, without any help from me. She hung up without responding. It was, I realized afterward, the first time in this entire ordeal that Denise Callahan had said something to me that wasn't carefully composed, wasn't calculated for effect. For just a moment, I'd heard something real underneath all her armor. Genuine, unguarded fear of losing everything. That fear, rather than humbling her, seemed only to sharpen her desperation further. 2 days later, Miguel discovered another section of fence cut, this time near the very easement road itself, cattle wandering dangerously close to traffic before he managed to herd them back onto safer ground. I called the sheriff again, adding this incident to the growing file Priya was building, evidence not just for the easement case, but potentially for a restraining order of my own against Denise directly, given the clear pattern of escalating actions targeting my property and now, indirectly, my safety. Devin, increasingly uneasy about Denise's erratic behavior, quietly told me he'd overheard her on a phone call outside the clubhouse, voice raised, saying something about making sure that road never actually closes, no matter what any judge says, a comment that chilled him enough to mention it to me directly. Priya took that report seriously, flagging it immediately as a potential warning sign of self-help remedies, meaning Denise might attempt to physically block or interfere with any future closure of the road herself. regardless of what the courts ultimately decided about ownership of the disputed easement. We petitioned the court for an expedited hearing date, citing both the fence-cutting incidents and Devon's overheard comment as evidence of escalating risk. The judge's clerk, reviewing our filing, moved the hearing up by 10 days, a small victory that suddenly felt enormously significant given the mounting tension. Denise, informed of the expedited date, reportedly grew even more agitated. According to homeowners who'd begun quietly documenting her behavior for their own removal proceedings.
Ruth described her at one point as a woman watching
as the removal vote and the injunction hearing both drew closer, converging like two storm fronts about to collide directly over Meadow Creek Estates, I found myself, for the first time since discovering that old easement document, genuinely uncertain what Denise Callahan might actually do next to protect herself. 3 days before the removal vote, Denise called an emergency board meeting of her own, one she controlled the agenda for entirely, attempting to push through a bylaw amendment that would require a supermajority, rather than a simple majority, to remove any sitting HOA president from office. The board, still containing 2 members loyal to Denise, approved the amendment in a rushed, poorly attended session, timed deliberately, homeowners believed, to make Frank's removal petition mathematically impossible to succeed under the newly changed rules she'd just forced through without proper community notice. Frank, furious, brought the bylaw change immediately to Priya, who identified an obvious procedural violation. HOA governing documents required 30 days written notice to all members before any bylaw amendment vote. Notice Denise had clearly never provided to the broader community she'd just rewritten the rules against. Priya drafted an emergency filing challenging the amendment's validity, arguing it was procedurally void and legally unenforceable given the notice violation. A filing the county judge, already reviewing our expedited easement hearing, agreed to hear on an accelerated basis given the clear overlap between both cases. Denise, informed her bylaw maneuver might collapse entirely, made what would become her most reckless decision yet. She contacted a towing company directly, without board authorization, and ordered them to begin blocking and ticketing vehicles near the shared access road, claiming unauthorized parking violations that had never existed before. Homeowners woke to find their own cars boxed in, tow trucks idling near the entrance, private security Denise had hired without any board vote checking IDs against a list she'd compiled herself, a list that, tellingly, excluded her own closest allies entirely from any scrutiny whatsoever. Devon's car was one of the first towed, despite having parked in the exact same spot every single day for 3 years without a single prior complaint from anyone. He called me immediately, more angry than I'd ever heard him, describing the scene as feeling less like a neighborhood and more like an occupation. Ruth captured video of the entire incident on her phone. Private security aggressively confronting homeowners. Tow trucks hauling away vehicles belonging to families who'd simply been asking questions about missing HOA funds for weeks. That footage would end up mattering far more than Denise could have possibly anticipated. The video spread through the neighborhood group chat within hours. Then beyond it, shared by frustrated homeowners on local social media pages, drawing attention from people who'd never even heard of Meadow Creek Estates before that morning, suddenly curious about what exactly was happening behind that quiet subdivision gate. A local news reporter, seeing the video circulate, reached out to Ruth directly, asking if anyone from the community would be willing to speak on camera about what appeared to be an HOA president using unauthorized private security to intimidate her own neighbors over an ongoing legal dispute. Ruth agreed immediately, as did Frank and Devon. all three sitting for interviews describing months of escalating harassment, unexplained financial gaps, and now what looked disturbingly like an attempt to physically control access to people's own homes using hired muscle nobody on the board had actually approved. I declined an on-camera interview myself, not wanting my ongoing legal case to become tabloid fodder before the judge had even ruled. But I did provide the reporter, through Priya, copies of the original 1994 easement and the county permits confirming its existence. All public record already. The resulting news segment aired 2 nights later, framing the story not around cattle or manure or property lines, but around a subdivision in apparent turmoil, an HOA president facing removal, a financial misconduct complaint, and now video evidence of unauthorized security intimidating homeowners over unpaid, disputed assessments. Denise, blindsided by the coverage, issued a defensive statement through her attorney calling the report one-sided and designed to embarrass a dedicated community leader. A statement that satisfied almost nobody, especially once local viewers began recognizing her name from 2 prior HOA controversies in neighboring counties. A viewer from one of Denise's previous communities, 2 counties over, contacted the news station directly after recognizing her face, describing eerily similar behavior years earlier. Unexplained assessments, aggressive control tactics, and a sudden resignation right before what several former neighbors described as questions got too serious. That follow-up story ran within the week, this time explicitly connecting Denise's pattern across 3 separate communities. Meadow Creek Estates simply being the latest, and by far the most publicly documented, chapter in what one former neighbor bluntly called the same playbook, different zip code. Homeowners who'd defended Denise for years, genuinely believing her complaints and assessments served the community's best interests, began publicly reconsidering everything they'd trusted her with, several posting apologies to Frank and Ruth in the neighborhood group chat for having doubted their earlier concerns. Denise, increasingly isolated even among her own former allies, made one final, desperate attempt to salvage her position before the removal vote and injunction hearing both arrived. She requested an emergency private meeting with me directly, away from lawyers, away from the board, just the 2 of us. I agreed, cautiously, choosing a public coffee shop rather than anywhere private, bringing Priya's paralegal along quietly at a nearby table just in case. Denise arrived looking, for the first time since I'd met her, genuinely diminished, the sharp confidence replaced by something rawer, more exhausted, more human. I just wanted this neighborhood to be something people were proud of, she said quietly, stirring coffee she never actually drank. I told her, as gently as I could manage given everything that had happened, that pride built on control and fear was never going to hold together permanently anyway. She asked, almost pleadingly, if I would consider dropping the easement claim in exchange for her stepping down quietly, avoiding both the criminal complaint and further public embarrassment. I told her honestly that decision was no longer mine to make alone, that Frank's financial complaint existed entirely separate from my land. You could have just talked to me, I added, thinking back to that very first manure complaint letter. Back when this could have simply been 2 neighbors working out a reasonable boundary between very different ways of living side by side. Denise looked away, unable, seemed, to answer that honestly. She left the coffee shop without another word, and I never spoke to her privately again after that day. Whatever chance existed for a quiet, dignified resolution had passed months earlier, buried somewhere beneath drones, survey crews, cut fences, and a bribery attempt aimed at my own ranch hand. 3 days later, The removal vote finally arrived. Meadow Creek's clubhouse overflowed with homeowners. Far more than any meeting Denise had presided over in years. Many holding printed copies of news articles, financial questions, and Frank's carefully documented timeline of unexplained expenses and mounting community distrust. Denise's attempted bylaw amendment, requiring supermajority approval, had already been struck down by the judge days earlier as procedurally invalid, restoring the original simple majority threshold, a ruling that visibly deflated whatever remaining confidence Denise had walked into that meeting still trying to project outward. The vote itself took less than 20 minutes to count. 83% of homeowners voted to remove Denise Callahan from the HOA presidency immediately, replacing her, on an interim basis, with Ruth, whose calm, transparent handling of the entire crisis had earned trust Denise had spent years slowly losing. Denise didn't stay for the results to be announced. Leaving quietly through a side door before the final count was even read aloud. A small, telling exit for a woman who'd once commanded every room she entered inside that same clubhouse with absolute, unquestioned authority. The removal, however, didn't end the criminal complaint Frank had already filed, nor did it resolve my own easement case, still scheduled before the judge. In just 4 remaining days, the 2 separate legal threads finally converging toward what felt, to everyone involved, like an inevitable, overdue reckoning. County investigators, alerted by Frank's complaint and emboldened by the news coverage, obtained a warrant for the HOA's full financial records. Records the interim board under Ruth's leadership handed over immediately and completely. Cooperation Denise herself had refused to offer for well over a year. Within those records, investigators found clear evidence of funds diverted not just toward the private investigator hired against me, but toward personal expenses, entirely unrelated to Meadow Creek estates, vacations, home renovations, and payments to the exact same towing company used during the illegal parking crackdown. Denise, questioned by investigators, reportedly grew defensive and evasive, unable to adequately explain thousands of dollars in transactions bearing her signature alone. Transactions the 2-member finance subcommittee that should have reviewed them had apparently never actually seen or approved at any point. News of the criminal investigation spread through the county quickly, adding fresh, damning context to everything homeowners had already witnessed firsthand. The drones, the survey crew, the towing, the removal vote. What had looked like an aggressive personality now looked, increasingly, like calculated, ongoing theft. I felt, watching all of it unfold from a careful distance, something more complicated than simple satisfaction. Denise Callahan hadn't been some cartoonish villain from the very beginning. She'd been someone whose need for control had metastasized, slowly, unchecked, into something that genuinely harmed real people around her. Miguel, whose recorded phone call had first cracked open the entire investigation, told me he felt no guilt at all for what happened to Denise afterward. She asked me to lie for money, he said simply. Whatever happens to her now, she built that herself, one choice at a time. 4 days before my hearing, the county formally charged Denise Callahan with felony misappropriation of association funds, along with a separate charge related to the attempted bribery of Miguel. Evidence Priya had carefully preserved and eventually shared with investigators once the criminal case took clear, undeniable shape. Denise's attorney, facing both the criminal charges and an increasingly hopeless easement case, contacted Priya requesting a final settlement conference. Before my scheduled hearing, hoping, seemed, to resolve at least one front of the collapsing situation quietly before things grew any worse for his client. Priya agreed to the conference, though she made clear to me privately that our position hadn't weakened at all. We simply wanted to explore whether a negotiated resolution might serve everyone better than a public ruling, given how much had already unfolded around this dispute by that point. I drove to the conference feeling strangely calm. Months of tension settling into something quieter, steadier. Whatever happened in that room, I knew the truth about my land, about the easement, about everything Denise had tried to bury beneath complaints and threats, was no longer in any real doubt. Denise's attorney opened by offering a proposed new easement agreement. Generous terms, a meaningful annual payment, full liability coverage, hoping to preserve the road's access before the judge could formally rule the strip of land entirely, unconditionally mine to do with as I saw fit going forward. Priya reviewed the offer carefully, then turned to me. The terms were genuinely quite fair, more than reasonable given everything, a solution that would let 50 families keep their road while finally compensating me properly for land that had, for 9 years, been used entirely without any legal right at all. I asked for one additional condition before agreeing to anything, a formal written apology to Miguel, on record, acknowledging Denise's attempted bribery, separate entirely from any criminal proceedings still pending against her. It wasn't about punishment. It was about making sure what happened to him was never quietly erased. Denise's attorney, clearly eager to close at least one matter before the criminal case consumed everything else, agreed on her behalf. Whether Denise felt any genuine remorse writing that apology, I'll never fully know, but the words existed now, on paper, undeniable, exactly like the easement had always been. We signed the new easement agreement that same afternoon. Terms fair, clear, and permanent this time, filed properly and immediately with the county to ensure no future confusion, no future lapse, no future Denise Callahan could ever again claim ignorance about who truly controlled that stretch of road. Ruth called me the moment she heard, relief evident in her voice. 50 homes. One phone call. And it's finally over, she said, laughing at how simply it had all resolved once the truth was finally allowed to surface fully. After everything Denise had done trying desperately to keep it buried. But it wasn't quite over yet. Not entirely. Denise still faced her criminal charges separately, a process that would unfold over the following months in county court. Far removed from Meadow Creek Estates clubhouse. Far removed from the neighborhood she'd once ruled with absolute, unquestioned authority. Word arrived that Denise had put her own house up for sale. Quietly, without any announcement to remaining neighbors. Planning seemed to leave the subdivision entirely before her criminal case even reached trial. Following what Priya noted was exactly the same pattern from her 2 previous communities. This time, though, the pattern couldn't simply erase what had already happened. News coverage had already connected her name across 3 separate HOA controversies. Criminal charges, unlike quiet resignations, followed a person regardless of which county they eventually chose to move toward next. I stood at my fence line one evening, watching the subdivision lights flicker on as they always had, no longer feeling the low, persistent dread that had colored that view for the better part of a year. The road was mine now, properly, legally, permanently, exactly as it always should have been. Ruth, as interim president, worked quickly to restore trust within the community, publishing full financial records, holding open meetings, answering every question homeowners raised without hesitation or defensiveness. Precisely the transparency Denise had always avoided offering anyone throughout her entire tenure running Meadow Creek Estates. Devin told me, months later, that the community finally felt like an actual neighborhood again, rather than a kingdom managed through fear and unexplained rules. "We just wanted good neighbors," he said. "Turns out we already had one. We just didn't know where to look until you showed us." Frank's financial complaint, combined with the county's own investigation, eventually revealed nearly $70,000 diverted over 3 years, an amount that stunned even homeowners who'd already grown deeply suspicious of Denise's leadership by the time the final, complete numbers were formally released. I testified briefly during Denise's eventual criminal proceedings, providing the timeline Priya and I had documented so carefully from the very beginning: the easement, the survey crew, the bribery attempt, the cut fences, evidence that painted a clear, undeniable pattern no defense attorney could meaningfully dispute. Denise, given the opportunity to speak during sentencing, offered a brief, subdued statement about losing perspective while trying to protect a community she genuinely cared about, words that felt, to those of us who'd lived through her escalating harassment, more like performance than actual accountability. The judge sentenced her to restitution payments covering the full diverted amount, along with probation and a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board within the state, a consequence that formally closed the door on the exact pattern she'd repeated across 3 separate communities. Denise sold her house within weeks of sentencing, moving, according to Ruth, somewhere out of state entirely, away from Meadow Creek Estates, away from the reputation that would follow her name through any local search anyone in her new community might eventually think to run. I never spoke to her again after that coffee shop conversation, though I sometimes wondered, standing at my fence line, whether she'd ever truly understood what had gone wrong, or whether she simply believed, as people like her often do, that she'd just been unlucky enough to get caught this time. Meadow Creek Estates, under Ruth's continued leadership, eventually elected a permanent board, one that formally thanked me, unexpectedly, at a community meeting I finally agreed to attend, for holding firm through something that could easily have gone very differently for 50 families who'd trusted the wrong person for years. I told them honestly I hadn't done it for thanks, only for the simple right to my own land, but I appreciated the gesture more than I let myself show that evening, standing in the same clubhouse where I'd once been publicly blamed for problems that had never actually been mine. My grandfather's old easement document now sits framed in my ranch office, not as a trophy exactly, but as a reminder of how quietly the truth can wait, patient and undisturbed, until someone finally takes the time to open the right drawer and actually read what's inside it. Miguel still works my northern pastures every calving season, the fence lines fully repaired, the cattle undisturbed by drones or survey crews or anything else beyond the ordinary, honest rhythms of ranch life that had drawn my grandfather to this land in the first place, decades before any of this began. Ruth and I still talk most weeks. Neighbors in the truest sense now. 2 very different lives. Cattle and cul-de-sacs, existing peacefully side by side exactly the way they always could have, if pride and control hadn't gotten so badly tangled up in one woman's need to own everything around her. Frank eventually retired fully from his informal accounting watchdog role, satisfied the community's finances were finally transparent, though he still jokes that 18 months of stonewalling taught him more about persistence than his entire professional career ever had before Denise Callahan tested it so thoroughly. Devin's family stayed in Meadow Creek Estates, his kids still riding golf carts past my fence line most afternoons, though now they wave differently. He told me once, like genuine neighbors rather than strangers separated by a dispute nobody except Denise had actually wanted in the first place. The road itself, still gravel, still narrow, still winding through the same stretch of pasture it always had, carries the same school buses and delivery trucks it always did, except now it does so under an agreement built on honesty, fair terms, and mutual respect instead of assumption and control. Sometimes, standing at that fence line in the evening, I think about how close 50 families came to losing their only way home over one woman's refusal to simply respect a boundary that was never actually hers to claim, control, or quietly steal in the first place. The final morning of what would become the last real confrontation began ordinarily enough. Mist still clinging low over my northern pasture, cattle grazing quietly near the very road that had, for months now, sat at the center of everything threatening to unravel both our lives completely. Miguel called me before sunrise, voice tight with alarm. Denise, weeks after her sentencing but still lingering in the area finalizing her house sale, had been spotted near the access road gate with a truck and what looked like heavy chain and bolt cutters loaded in the bed. I drove out immediately, heart pounding, remembering Devon's overheard warning from months earlier about making sure that road never actually closed, no matter what any judge decided. Whatever restraint Denise had shown since sentencing had finally, completely run out that particular morning. I arrived to find Denise standing at the gate Ruth's board had installed after the settlement. Chain already wrapped around the new locking mechanism. Tempting, it appeared, to force the road permanently open regardless of the legal agreement she herself had signed only weeks earlier under her own attorney's advice. "You don't get to just close this," she shouted the moment she saw my truck. Something wild and unraveled in her voice that I'd never heard from her before. Not during the meetings, not during the hearing, not even during our final coffee shop conversation months earlier. I stayed in my truck, calling the sheriff immediately rather than approaching her directly, remembering every piece of advice Priya had given me about documentation, distance, and never, ever escalating a confrontation myself when the law was already so clearly, completely on my side already. Denise, apparently unaware I'd already called for help, continued trying to force the gate mechanism, muttering about 50 families and what she'd built, words that sounded less like genuine concern for her former neighbors and more like a woman desperately trying to reclaim some final scrap of control. A county patrol car arrived within 12 minutes. The deputy recognizing Denise immediately from the earlier fence-cutting reports and criminal proceedings already on file. She was still holding the bolt cutters when he approached. Chain half-wrapped. The gate itself, thankfully, still fully intact and secure. The deputy asked her to step away from the gate, explaining calmly that she was trespassing on private property already subject to a valid, signed legal agreement, one she herself had negotiated and formally accepted just weeks before this exact, deeply confusing morning confrontation had somehow occurred. Denise's composure finally, completely cracked in that moment. Months of mounting consequences, the removal vote, the criminal charges, the sentencing, the forced house sale, all of it seeming to collapse at once. Right there at the very gate that had started this entire ordeal so many months earlier. "I gave everything to this place," she said, voice breaking, no longer performing for anyone, no longer calculating for effect. Just a woman standing at a locked gate realizing, perhaps for the very first time, that nothing she'd built there had ever actually belonged to her alone. The deputy, following standard procedure given her active probation status, placed her under arrest for trespassing and probation violation. The bolt cutters and chain photographed as evidence, adding one final, undeniable chapter to a pattern that had, by then, spanned 3 separate communities across nearly a decade. I stood at a distance the entire time, feeling none of the satisfaction I might have once imagined I'd feel watching Denise Callahan finally completely lose everything she'd fought so hard, so wrongly, to keep. Instead, I just felt tired and sad and profoundly relieved it was finally, truly over. Ruth arrived moments after the patrol car left, having heard the commotion from her own porch nearby. We stood together at the gate, quiet for a long moment, watching mist finally begin to burn off across the pasture where 50 homes' entire future had once, briefly, hung in the balance. She really thought she could just take it back, Ruth said eventually, shaking her head slowly. I told her I wasn't surprised. Not really. People who build their entire identity around control rarely know how to simply let go, even when every single door has already, clearly, closed around them completely. Denise's probation violation, combined with the new trespassing charge, resulted in additional jail time, a consequence far more serious than her original sentencing had required, entirely self-inflicted by a decision made in a moment of pure, unraveling desperation at a gate that was never, ever hers. Word spread through Meadow Creek Estates within hours, homeowners gathering near the entrance to see the scene for themselves, the chain still lying where the deputy had left it as evidence, the gate itself standing exactly as strong and secure as it had the entire, uneventful morning before. Devon told me later that seeing the actual chain, the actual bolt cutters, finally made the entire ordeal feel real to some neighbors who'd still, quietly, held onto some sympathy for Denise despite everything, believing perhaps she'd simply made mistakes rather than deliberately, repeatedly chosen harm over honesty. That sympathy, understandably, evaporated almost entirely once the story of the gate spread fully through the community, replaced by something closer to simple, exhausted relief that whatever chapter Denise Callahan represented in Meadow Creek Estates history had, finally, unmistakably, permanently reached its true and complete end. I gave a brief statement to the sheriff's department documenting the morning's events, adding it to the already substantial file Priya had maintained throughout the entire ordeal, a file that had grown, over the better part of a year, from a single lapsed easement into something far larger entirely. Priya, reviewing the new charges, told me simply that this final incident would almost certainly extend Denise's total time in custody significantly, a consequence entirely of her own making, entirely avoidable, had she simply accepted the settlement she herself had signed just weeks earlier in good faith. I drove home that afternoon past the gate, still standing firm, still locked, still exactly where it belonged, and felt, for the first time in nearly a year, something genuinely close to peace settle over the entire disputed stretch of road that had once threatened to define my entire life. Miguel repaired the small scratch marks left on the gate's locking mechanism within the hour, cattle grazing calmly nearby as though nothing unusual had occurred at all that morning, the quiet, ordinary rhythm of ranch life reasserting itself exactly as it always eventually did, no matter what chaos passed through. Ruth's interim board formally commended the sheriff's department for their quick response and quietly updated the community's security protocols to prevent any similar unauthorized access attempts in the future, a formality more than anything, given how thoroughly Denise's own actions had already sealed her permanent exile from Meadow Creek Estates. Frank, hearing about the gate incident, simply shook his head when Ruth told him, saying only that it confirmed everything he'd already suspected about how deeply Denise's need for control ran deeper, seemed, than any consequence, any charge, any sentence could ever fully, meaningfully reach or resolve. Devon's kids still rode their golf carts past the gate that same afternoon, waving at Miguel as he finished the small repair, blissfully unaware of how close their entire neighborhood had once come, that very morning, to a confrontation that could have ended far more dangerously than it thankfully actually did. I called Priya that evening simply to thank her for everything: the easement research, the injunction defense, the settlement negotiation, all of it culminating finally in this quiet, unremarkable moment of a gate standing locked and secure exactly where it belonged, exactly as the law had always said it should. "You did the hard part," she told me. "You stayed patient. Most people in your position would have either caved to the pressure or become just as ruthless as she was. You did neither, and that's exactly why this ended the way it did." I thought about that for a long time afterward, standing once more at my fence line as evening settled fully over the ranch. Cattle grazing peacefully, the subdivision lights flickering on in their familiar rows, the road between us finally, truly, legally, and permanently settled after everything. Denise Callahan's name, I later learned, would follow her through court records regardless of which state she eventually settled in after her release. Permanent, searchable consequence of choices made across 3 separate communities over nearly a decade of unchecked, escalating control disguised as leadership. Meadow Creek Estates, meanwhile, moved forward under transparent, accountable leadership, the 50 families who lived there finally understanding fully just how close they'd come to losing their only way home, and just how quietly, patiently, the truth had waited, undisturbed, for someone to finally take the time to find it. The formal criminal sentencing hearing, delayed slightly by the gate incident's new charges, finally concluded 3 weeks later in the county courthouse. A small, unremarkable room that felt, given everything that had unfolded, strangely disproportionate to the scale of harm Denise Callahan had ultimately caused so many people. I attended, along with Ruth, Frank, and Devon, sitting quietly in the gallery as the judge read through the full, combined record, misappropriation, attempted bribery, trespassing, and probation violation, a pattern the judge described bluntly as a sustained, deliberate abuse of a position built entirely on community trust. Denise, standing before the bench, offered another brief statement, quieter this time, less defensive than her earlier sentencing remarks, acknowledging finally, if only partially, that she had let control become more important than the people she'd always claimed to be protecting throughout her entire tenure. The judge sentenced her to additional custody time for the trespassing and probation violations, extending her total consequences significantly beyond the original. Financial restitution and board ban, along with a formal, permanent restraining order preventing any future contact with me, Miguel, Ruth, Frank, or Devon whatsoever. Priya told me afterward that the combined sentence, while not enormous by criminal standards, represented something more important than mere punishment, a clear, official, undeniable record establishing exactly what had happened, exactly who was responsible, and exactly why 50 families had nearly lost their only way home. I felt, walking out of that courthouse into ordinary afternoon sunlight, A strange kind of quiet closure settled fully over me for the very first time since finding that old easement folder in my grandfather's filing cabinet nearly a year earlier, back when this had all still felt so small. Ruth squeezed my arm outside the courthouse steps. Both of us silent for a long moment, watching Frank and Devin talk quietly nearby, for neighbors from two entirely different worlds who'd ended up, somehow, on exactly the same side of something none of us had ever asked to be part of. 50 homes, Ruth said finally, echoing words she'd used months earlier at the very beginning of all this. One phone call to Priya, and their only way out was closed forever, until we made sure it opened again the right way. Fair to everyone. Honest for once. I drove home that evening past the gate one final time, watching it stand exactly as it should. Locked when needed, open when agreed upon, governed now by a fair, properly filed easement rather than assumption, control, or one woman's unchecked need to own everything within sight of her own porch. Miguel met me at the barn, cattle settling into evening quiet around us, the ordinary rhythms of ranch life continuing exactly as they had for 3 generations before this entire ordeal, and would, I hoped, continue for generations still to come after everyone involved had long since moved on. My grandfather's easement document remains framed in my office, no longer just a curious piece of family history, but a quiet, permanent reminder of how patiently the truth can wait, undisturbed in a dusty filing cabinet, for exactly the right moment to finally, completely change everything. Ruth continued serving as Meadow Creek Estate's elected president long after the interim period ended, homeowners entrusting her, willingly and repeatedly, with exactly the transparency and honesty Denise had spent years actively avoiding throughout her entire, ultimately self-destructive tenure running that same community. Frank finally retired his informal watchdog role completely, satisfied the community's finances remained fully transparent under new leadership, though he kept copies of his original handwritten estimates, framed humorously in his own home office, right beside a printed copy of the news segment that first broke everything open publicly. Devin's kids grew up genuinely knowing their rancher neighbor now, stopping by occasionally to see new calves in spring, waving each morning as they passed my fence line on their way to school. Exactly the kind of simple, ordinary neighborliness that should have existed from the very beginning. I still run cattle across the same 1,100 acres my grandfather bought in 1958. The northern pasture road now governed by a fair, permanent, properly filed agreement instead of an expired 15-year lease nobody had bothered to check, review, or renew for nearly a full decade. Denise Callahan's name occasionally surfaces still, in county records, in news archives, in cautionary conversations among other homeowners associations who'd heard, secondhand, about a woman whose need for absolute control ultimately cost her everything. 3 communities, her freedom, and finally, completely, her own carefully constructed reputation. I think about her sometimes, standing at my fence line in the evening, not with anger exactly, but with a quiet, settled understanding that some people simply never learn how to share a boundary, a road, or a community until every single door they've tried so hard to control finally, completely closes. Ruth still jokes, whenever the story comes up among neighbors, that it all started with one filing cabinet, one dusty folder, one expired agreement nobody had thought to check for 9 entire years, and ended with 50 families finally, properly, fairly securing their own way home for good. I never set out to close anyone's road, or end anyone's career, or become the reason 50 homeowners rebuilt their entire community from the ground up. I only ever wanted my land, and the boundary my grandfather had fairly, honestly agreed to, respected exactly as it was always meant to be. That, in the end, was all it ever took: patience, documentation, and the simple, unshakable truth of a single lapsed agreement, waiting quietly in a filing cabinet for exactly the right moment to remind everyone involved who truly held the only key to that gate all along. The road stands open still today, exactly as it should, fair, legal, and permanent, while the gate that almost closed forever now simply exists as it was always meant to: quiet, ordinary boundary between two different lives finally, properly, peacefully at rest. In the months following Denise's final sentencing, Meadow Creek Estates rebuilt its finances fully, repaying homeowners improperly assessed fees and restoring the community's trust through transparent, publicly available records Ruth's board maintained diligently. Exactly the accountability Denise had spent years successfully avoiding. Frank's original financial complaint ultimately helped recover nearly all of the diverted funds through Denise's court-ordered restitution.
Money returned gradually to the community she'd once controlled so completely. A slow, steady correction to years of quiet, unquestioned financial harm nobody had caught in time.
Devon's family, along with the other 49 households, finally understood the full value of the easement agreement Priya had negotiated. Secure now in knowing their only way home rested on solid legal ground rather than an unchecked assumption one determined woman had almost successfully exploited completely. I settled fully back into ordinary ranch life. Calving seasons, fence repairs, quiet evenings watching cattle graze beneath a sky unchanged by anything that had happened below it. The entire ordeal fading slowly into simply another chapter in my family's long, patient relationship with this particular piece of land. Ruth and I remain close neighbors and friends today. Two different lives existing exactly as peacefully as they always could have. Cattle and cul-de-sacs sharing one quiet road, governed now by fairness and honesty instead of control, fear, and one woman's unchecked need to own everything around her. In the end, it was never really about the road, or the fence, or even the 50 homes standing quietly beyond it. It was about what happens when someone builds their entire identity on control, and what happens, eventually, when the truth simply waits, patiently, for its moment to finally arrive. 50 homes. One dusty filing cabinet nobody had opened in years. That was all it ever took to close a door Denise Callahan believed would stay open for her forever, and to finally, properly open the right one for everyone else who actually deserved it.